The first shift, the city lights shimmered faintly against the night sky as Ryan Carter stepped out of a taxi and into the narrow alley that led to the employee entrance of the North Avenue Grill. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another tired worker reporting for duty at the end of a long day. His uniform was borrowed, an oversized black polo shirt, faded black pants, and cheap shoes that pinched his feet with every step. A paper name tag, clipped crookedly to his chest, read Kyle. That was the name he would answer to tonight. Not Ryan, not Mr. Carter, not the man who sat at the head of a sprawling corporation that owned more than 300 restaurants across the country. Just Kyle, the new dishwasher. Ryan had done this once before, years ago, when the company was still small. His mentor, James Whitfield, had taught him that the soul of a restaurant could not be measured in sales reports or sleek boardroom presentations. It could only be felt in the kitchen, among the clanging pans, the sweat, and the endless pressure of a dinner rush. James had told him once, "If you ever want to know who we really are, spend a night at the sink." Back then, Ryan was a young man, eager and curious, but tonight was different. Tonight, he was here because whispers had reached him, rumors of mistreatment, of staff being pushed beyond their limits, of managers who thought profit mattered more than people. He pushed through the heavy metal door into the narrow hallway that smelled faintly of grease and bleach. The hum of refrigerators vibrated against the walls. The deeper he went, the louder the sound became, the kitchen in full swing, a chaos of orders shouted over the hiss of frying pans. He paused, adjusting his cap, steadying himself. If anyone recognized him, the experiment would be over before it began. He needed to see the truth unfiltered, not the polished performance managers put on when the CEO came to visit. "Hey, you must be the new guy," a tall cook called out without looking up from the sizzling skillet in front of him. "Dishes are back there. Good luck surviving." The man's tone was half joking, half serious. Ryan nodded silently and slipped past, already sweating from the heat. The dish station was tucked into the farthest corner of the kitchen, a narrow space dominated by an industrial sink, racks of dirty plates stacked high in a conveyor belt that rattled endlessly. And there, bent over the sink, sleeves rolled to her elbows, arms deep in soapy water, was Emma Hayes. She didn't notice him at first. Her movements were practiced, efficient, almost mechanical. One hand scrubbed, the other stacked, her body swaying slightly to a rhythm only she could hear. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun beneath a faded cap, strands sticking to the sweat on her temple. Her apron was soaked, stained with sauces and grease. Yet there was something about her posture, rigid but weary, that struck Ryan immediately. When she finally glanced at him, her eyes were startlingly clear, a pale blue dulled only by exhaustion. She gave him the faintest of nods, then returned to her work without a word. "I'm Kyle," he said quietly, setting down his backpack in the corner. "Emma," she replied, her voice soft, carrying no energy for introductions. She pointed to a smaller sink at the side. "Start with those. Glasses. Don't break them." Ryan pulled on rubber gloves and got to work, dipping his hands into water that was far too hot. The sting made him wince, but Emma didn't flinch when she plunged her own hands into the scalding basin. She didn't complain. She didn't even react. It was as though her skin had grown used to the pain. The secrets of the kitchen. The second night Ryan returned to the North Avenue Grill, the air already felt heavier, as though the building itself carried the exhaustion of the people inside it. He had barely stepped through the side door before the heat of the kitchen hit him like a wall. The stench of burned oil mixed with the sour tang of bleach and dishwater, wrapping around him, clinging to his clothes, making him feel like he'd been there for hours, even though his shift had just begun. He adjusted his crooked name tag again, Kyle, and walked back toward the dish station where Emma was already at work. She looked even more tired than the night before. Her movements were steady, but her eyes seemed clouded with a weariness that went deeper than sleeplessness. The dark circles beneath her eyes told their own story, one of too many hours spent here and not enough spent anywhere else. When she noticed him, she gave a faint nod of acknowledgement, but she didn't smile. Smiling, Ryan thought, probably took more energy than she had left. He slipped on his gloves and joined her. The pile of dishes waiting tonight was even taller, stacks teetering like small towers ready to collapse at the slightest touch. For long minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rush of water, the scrape of brushes against plates, the clatter of cutlery dropped into metal bins, and the endless shouts of the cooks. The kitchen was its own storm. Orders barked, flames flaring up on grills, servers weaving in and out with trays balanced on their shoulders. And in the middle of it all, the dish station stood like a forgotten corner where those who worked hardest were seen the least. Ryan had run companies, negotiated contracts worth millions, spoken to rooms full of executives who hung on his every word. Yet here, in this sweaty corner, his presence was invisible. No one cared who Kyle. He was, only that he kept up with the relentless tide of dishes. That invisibility was freeing in some ways, but it was also sobering. It reminded him of how many people in his company lived unseen, their struggles erased by the numbers that looked tidy on spreadsheets. It was Dennis, the manager, who broke the silence first. His voice carried above the noise, sharp and harsh. "Emma, where's that tray of glasses I told you to have ready? The bar's waiting." Emma set down a plate and quickly began pulling clean glasses from the rack, lining them up on a tray. Ryan noticed the way her hands moved a little too quickly, almost trembling, as if one more mistake would bring down more wrath than she could bear. She slid the tray toward a server, who muttered a rushed thanks before disappearing again. Dennis didn't say thank you, he never did. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and stalked back toward the line, his eyes sweeping the room like a hawk searching for prey. When Dennis was gone, Ryan leaned slightly toward Emma. "Does he always talk to you like that?" he asked softly, careful not to draw attention. She gave a short, humorless laugh. That's nothing. You should hear him when he really loses his temper." Her eyes flicked toward him for a brief moment, then back to the dishes. "Don't worry about it. Best thing you can do here is keep your head down." Ryan wanted to argue, to tell her that no one deserved to be treated that way, but he kept his thoughts to himself. He was here to observe, to understand, not to reveal who he was. Not yet. As the night wore on, he began to notice more. The way some of the line cooks joked with each other, but their laughter held a nervous edge, as though they knew it could vanish the moment Dennis appeared. The way servers rushed past, never making eye contact with Emma, as if afraid that being kind to her might somehow slow them down. The way Emma herself seemed to fold inward whenever Dennis barked orders, shrinking smaller even though she never stopped working. And then, during a brief lull, Ryan saw something that unsettled him more than Dennis's shouting. Emma reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a crumpled notebook. She opened it quickly, scribbled something down with the stub of a pencil, and then tucked it away again before anyone could notice. Ryan was close enough to catch a glimpse of the page, rows of numbers, some circled, some crossed out, others marked with tiny stars. "What's that?" he asked carefully, not wanting to pry too openly. Emma's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed scrubbing. "Nothing, just keeping track." "Of what?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she gave him a look that seemed to weigh whether he could be trusted. After a long pause, she said quietly, "Hours, pay, overtime, or at least what should be overtime." She dipped a plate into the sink, the motion sharp, almost angry. "They don't put everything on the pay stubs, you know. Half the time Dennis tells us we need to volunteer extra shifts, says it's for the good of the restaurant, says the company will reward loyalty, but loyalty doesn't buy groceries." Ryan's chest tightened. He had suspected mismanagement, but this was worse than he feared. If her notebook was accurate, then his managers weren't just pushing people too hard, they were stealing from them. He kept his voice steady. "And you've been keeping records?" "Someone has to," she said, her tone low, almost defiant. "If I ever get the chance, I'll show it to someone who cares, but around here, no one does. If I complain, I lose my job, and I can't afford that." She turned back to her work, clearly signaling that the conversation was over. Ryan fell silent, but his mind raced. He had always prided himself on running a company that valued people. He believed in James's lessons, in treating workers with respect. But what Emma had just revealed shook him. Had things really deteriorated so much under his nose? Had the layers of middle management built a wall so thick that voices like hers could never reach him? As the hours passed, Ryan watched more closely. He noticed that Emma wasn't the only one staying late. Maria, a line cook with tired eyes and calloused hands, stayed behind after her shift officially ended, wiping down stations Dennis claimed hadn't been cleaned well enough. Another young man in the prep area chopped vegetables long after the kitchen closed, his shoulders drooping, his movements sluggish. When Ryan asked him quietly why he was still there, the man shrugged and muttered, "Because Dennis said if I leave, I don't come back tomorrow." By 2 a.m, when the last pan was scrubbed and the kitchen finally began to quiet, Ryan's body ached in places he had forgotten could ache. Emma leaned heavily against the sink, rubbing her wrists. He noticed the faint redness around them, raw from hours of scalding water and harsh chemicals. She didn't complain, but the sight of her hands stirred something fierce in him. "You shouldn't have to do this," he said softly. Her laugh was hollow. "Shouldn't, maybe. But I don't get to choose." Ryan wanted to tell her she did have a choice, that she deserved better, that if she knew who he really was, everything could change. But the words caught in his throat. He couldn't reveal himself, not yet. If he did, Dennis and the others would scramble to cover their tracks, and the truth would be buried again. He needed proof. He needed to see just how deep the rot went. When Emma finally clocked out, she didn't head home like Ryan expected. Instead, she sat on a bench outside the back door, pulled her notebook out again, and began writing by the light of a flickering street lamp. Ryan lingered nearby, pretending to tie his shoes, but really watching her. Her face was set in determination, her lips pressed tightly together. Whatever she was writing mattered deeply to her. And as he watched her, Ryan realized the heartbreaking truth. Emma wasn't just surviving these double shifts. She was documenting them, one by one, clinging to the fragile hope that someday, somehow, someone would notice. That night, as Ryan walked home in the darkness, he carried more than just the ache of tired muscles. He carried the weight of Emma's silence, the bitterness of Dennis's cruelty, and the knowledge that his company, was crushing people under the guise of loyalty and profit. And he knew he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. The breaking point. By the third night, Ryan already knew the rhythms of the kitchen. He could anticipate the wave of dirty dishes crashing into the station when the dinner rush hit, knew the sharp voices of the servers when they yelled for clean glasses, and recognized the dull heaviness in Emma's shoulders as she braced herself for another endless shift. But knowing the rhythm did not make it easier. It only made him more aware of how brutal and dehumanizing it all was. When he entered the back door that evening, Emma was already there, scrubbing at a stack of greasy pans so tall they looked like they might topple. Her arms moved with mechanical precision, but her face was pale, lips pressed thin. Ryan could tell immediately that she hadn't slept well. Her hair was damp, as if she'd washed it in a rush and tied it back without caring whether it stayed neat. She gave him a faint nod, but her eyes looked far away, distracted. "Rough day?" Ryan asked softly, keeping his voice low so Dennis wouldn't hear. Emma gave a small, tired laugh without humor. "Same as always, didn't even get time to eat before coming in, but hey, at least I'm alive, right?" Ryan wanted to ask more, wanted to press gently until she told him the truth of her exhaustion, but before he could, Dennis's voice cut across the kitchen like a whip. "Hayes, those pans should have been done 10 minutes ago. The line's waiting." Emma stiffened, muttered a quick, "Yes, sir," and bent lower over the sink. Ryan clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. He could see the way Dennis looked at her, not with respect, not even with professional urgency, but with disdain, as though she were less than human, just another piece of equipment to bark orders at. The rush that night was heavier than usual. Orders poured in, piling up on the counter until the cooks shouted over each other in frustration. The heat rose, suffocating, filling every breath with the stench of oil and smoke. Emma worked at a frantic pace, scrubbing, rinsing, stacking. Ryan tried to match her speed, but sweat poured down his back and his hands ached from the endless scalding water. Still, Emma never slowed. It was near the peak of the rush when the accident happened. A cook dropped a boiling pan of water onto the counter too close to the dish station, and the splash sent steaming liquid across the floor. Emma, already juggling a tray of glasses, slipped. Time seemed to slow. The The tray shattered as it hit the ground, shards of glass scattering in every direction. Emma stumbled forward, catching herself on the sink, but a sharp cry escaped her lips. Ryan dropped his brush and rushed to her side. Her wrist had twisted badly when she caught herself, and he could see the red burn on her forearm where some of the boiling water had splashed. "Emma, are you okay?" And he asked, reaching instinctively to steady her. Before she could answer, Dennis appeared, storming toward them, his face flushed with rage. "What the hell was that? Do you know how much those glasses cost?" His eyes darted to the broken shards littering the floor, then back to Emma. "You're clumsy as hell, always making mistakes." "She's hurt," Ryan said sharply, unable to stay silent. "She needs first aid." Dennis turned his glare on Ryan, eyes narrowing. "And who asked you, rookie? You keep your mouth shut unless you want to be out the door." Ryan's fists curled inside his gloves. Every part of him wanted to drop the disguise, to tell Dennis exactly who he was, to strip him of his authority on the spot. But he forced himself to hold back. Not yet. If he blew his cover now, everything Emma had recorded, every piece of evidence could be swept under the rug before he had time to act. Emma shook her head quickly, as though begging Ryan not to make it worse. She bent down, her injured hand trembling, and began gathering shards of glass. "It's fine," she whispered, though her voice cracked with pain. "I'm fine." Dennis sneered. "Clean it up. And don't think you're leaving early just because you got a little burn. We're short-staffed tonight. You'll finish the shift like everyone else." He turned on his heel and stormed away. Ryan crouched beside Emma, his chest tight with fury. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. But Emma shook her head again, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Yes, I do," she murmured. "If I walk out, I don't come back tomorrow. And if I don't come back tomorrow, I don't pay rent. I don't buy groceries. I don't—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. Ryan wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there were laws, protections, ways to fight back. But deep down, he knew what she meant. For someone like her, living paycheck to paycheck, fear of unemployment was a chain stronger than any law. The rest of the night dragged like a nightmare. Emma worked with her injured arm, every movement slower, more painful. Ryan tried to take more of the load, scrubbing harder, stacking faster, but no matter how much he did, Dennis still found ways to berate Emma. By closing time, Ryan's anger had reached a boiling point. He stayed behind after the last dish was put away, pretending to wipe down the counters so he could watch Emma. She moved sluggishly, her shoulders slumped, her burn now an angry red mark across her skin. When she thought no one was watching, she pressed her hand to her face and let out a small sob. Ryan's chest ached at the sight. He had seen employees cry before, young workers overwhelmed by stress or fear, but it had always been at a distance, something handled by HR reports or managerial notes. He had never stood this close, never felt the rawness of it pressing into his bones. He wanted to speak, to comfort her, but he stayed silent. He had to let the story unfold, had to see just how deep the cruelty ran. Only then could he expose it all. When Emma finally clocked out, she slipped her notebook from her apron and scribbled down notes again. Ryan watched her hands, trembling slightly as she wrote. He wondered how many pages she had filled, how much pain had been cataloged in her careful handwriting. As they walked out into the night, Ryan fell into step beside her. "Why do you keep coming back?" he asked softly, unable to hold the question in any longer. Emma paused, her eyes fixed on the cracked pavement ahead. After a long silence, she said, "Because people are counting on me. And because, if I don't endure this, who will?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word cut into Ryan's chest like a blade. For the first time since beginning this undercover mission, Ryan felt something dangerously close to breaking inside him. This wasn't just about bad management or unpaid shifts anymore. This was about a system that swallowed people whole, leaving them invisible, broken, and silent. Emma's hidden story. The fourth night began differently. The kitchen still roared with the same chaos, flames leaping from pans, orders shouted across the line, servers weaving in and out like frantic dancers. But Ryan's eyes no longer drifted across the whole room. His focus was fixed, sharpened like a blade. He had seen Emma's pain, witnessed the injury, and felt the crushing weight of her silence. But what gnawed at him most was the unanswered question that lingered in his mind long after his shifts ended. Why did she keep going? Ryan had spent enough of his career studying human behavior to know that no one endured such conditions without reason. There had to be something deeper, some hidden tether that chained Emma to this place. It was not loyalty. Dennis had burned that away long ago. It was not pride. He had seen the way she swallowed humiliation night after night. No, it was something else, something hidden, and Ryan was determined to uncover it. That night he worked with a different rhythm. He scrubbed dishes, rinsed, stacked, moved through the endless tide of plates, but his mind was elsewhere. He was listening to the way Emma spoke only when necessary, listening to the way her eyes lingered on the clock when she thought no one noticed, listening to the small sigh she let out when Dennis barked yet another insult. There was a story buried beneath those gestures, and Ryan intended to hear it. When the last rush slowed and the piles of dishes shrank to a manageable level, Emma excused herself briefly, muttering something about needing air. She slipped out the back door, her apron still tied, her hands raw and red. Ryan hesitated, then followed a few minutes later, pushing open the heavy door that groaned on rusty hinges. Outside, the alley was quiet. The buzz of the neon sign flickered faintly above the restaurant's rear exit, casting strange shadow west across the brick walls. Emma sat on the cold concrete step, her arms wrapped loosely around her knees, her gaze fixed on some faraway point in the darkness. In her lap rested the small battered notebook. She didn't notice Ryan at first, too lost in whatever storm churned inside her mind. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked gently. Her head turned, eyes flashing briefly with suspicion before softening. She gave a small nod and he lowered himself onto the step beside her. For a long time, neither spoke. The muffled noise of the kitchen seeped through the door, but out here, the world felt suspended, quieter, more fragile. Finally, Ryan gestured toward the notebook. "You keep track of everything in there, don't you?" Emma glanced down at it, fingers tightening protectively around its edges. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, but then with a small sigh she said, "Yes, hours, wages, shifts, but also..." She hesitated, then opened the notebook, flipping to a different section near the back. She held it out for him to see. The pages were filled not with numbers but with lists, grocery items carefully budgeted, bills marked with due dates, notes scribbled about doctor's appointments, and, tucked in between, small reminders like buy shoes for Lily or check school forms for Matt. Ryan read silently, his chest tightening with every word. These weren't notes for herself. These were notes for others. Emma reached forward and tapped the page lightly, her voice soft. "My siblings. Lily's 11, Matt's 9. They're all I've got left. Our mom died 2 years ago. Dad walked out long before that. If I don't hold everything together, there's no one else." Her voice caught, but she steadied it quickly, swallowing the crack in her throat. "So, yes, I work double shifts. Yes, I let Dennis scream at me. Yes, I take it. Because as long as I do, Lily and Matt have a roof over their heads. They eat, they go to school, they get to be kids. And if I break, they lose all of that. The CEO's dilemma." By the 5th night, Ryan's disguise as Kyle no longer felt like a disguise. His hands bore the same raw cracks and blisters as Emma's. His back carried the same dull ache that came from bending over endless stacks of pans, and the smell of grease seemed to have seeped permanently into his skin. When he walked into the North Avenue Grill now, he didn't feel like a visiting CEO in borrowed clothes. He felt like one of them, a worker swallowed whole by the storm of the kitchen, invisible to the customers, forgotten by the managers who barked orders but never lifted a hand to help. Yet while his body adjusted to the labor, his mind refused to settle. Each day he wrestled with the same tormenting question: when should he act? Every instinct screamed at him to reveal who he was, to expose Dennis and put an end to the cruelty Emma endured. But reason held him back. He knew from years of corporate battles that timing mattered as much as truth. If he revealed himself too early, Dennis would scramble to erase the evidence, employees would be pressured into silence, and Emma's carefully documented notebook would be dismissed as exaggeration. But if he waited too long, if he stayed silent while Emma suffered, what kind of leader did that make him? The dilemma ate at him more each night. That evening, the storm of orders was particularly brutal. A party of 20 had filled the dining room, sending wave after wave of dishes back to the sink. The line cooks barked at each other, Dennis stormed around like a drill sergeant, and the servers darted in and out with sweat dripping down their temples. Through it all, Emma moved like a machine, scrubbing, stacking, hauling, her injured wrist wrapped in a makeshift bandage that was already soaked through. Ryan tried to shoulder more of the work, taking trays from her before she could lift them, scrubbing pans until his arms burned, but it was never enough. At one point, Dennis stormed over red-faced, waving a crumpled receipt in his hand. "Hayes, I told you 3 times to make sure the glasses were polished before they went out. A customer just complained. Do you have any idea what that does to my reputation?" Emma flinched but said nothing, her hands never stopping their work. Ryan stepped forward before he could stop himself. "That wasn't her fault. She's been drowning in dishes all night. You can't expect her to do the work of 3 people at once." The room went silent for a beat. Dennis turned slowly, his eyes narrowing on Ryan. "And who exactly do you think you are, rookie? You've been here, what, 4 shifts? You don't tell me how to run my kitchen." His lip curled in a sneer. "You want to play hero? Fine. You can stay an extra 2 hours after closing and polish every damn glass in this building yourself." The cook snickered nervously, grateful the heat had shifted away from them. Emma shot Ryan a look, half warning, half pleading, silently begging him not to push further. Ryan clenched his jaw, forcing down the urge to rip off his name tag and announce himself. Not yet, not like this. Later that night, as the last pans were stacked and the kitchen finally grew quiet, Ryan lingered by the sink. He had made up his mind. He needed proof, not just anger. And if he couldn't reveal himself yet, he would gather every piece of evidence he could. He began subtly, almost imperceptibly. When Dennis forced Maria to stay late without pay, Ryan noted the exact time. When Emma's shift stretched past 16 hours, he made a mental calculation of what her wages should have been versus what Dennis claimed she'd volunteered. When Dennis barked insults, Ryan tucked away the words, memorizing the venom in his tone. And when Emma pulled out her notebook to scribble her own records, Ryan leaned closer, memorizing the careful precision of her handwriting, the way she circled numbers and underlined hours. Over the next few nights, Ryan secretly began keeping his own record, scrawling notes on scraps of paper he tucked into his backpack. He documented everything: unpaid shifts, dangerous working conditions, verbal abuse, violations of safety codes. He even snapped discreet photos with his phone when no one was looking. Broken equipment, expired cleaning chemicals, time cards showing hours erased or rewritten. Piece by piece, he was building a case. But the more evidence he gathered, the heavier his heart became. Because while the documents told one story of exploitation, Emma's face told another, the human cost hidden behind the numbers. Her body grew thinner, her shoulders more slumped, her eyes heavier with exhaustion. Some nights, she barely spoke at all, too drained to even whisper the small pleasantries that once broke the silence. One night after closing, Ryan followed her as she walked home. He kept a careful distance, not wanting her to feel watched, but close enough to see where she went. She lived in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of the city, its bricks chipped, its windows patched with tape. The building looked as weary as its tenants. He watched as Emma climbed the stairs and unlocked a door with a faded number scratched onto it. Through the thin walls, faint laughter floated out, a child's laughter. Ryan lingered there for a long moment, the sound tugging at his heart. He pictured Lily and Matt, the siblings Emma had spoken about, their joy preserved only because Emma shouldered so much sorrow. That was when the weight of his dilemma pressed harder than ever. He wasn't just an observer anymore. Every night he stayed silent, Emma bore wounds that were his to prevent. Every shift he let Dennis spew venom unchecked, her dignity was chipped away. When he finally turned to walk back to his hotel, Ryan's mind was a storm. He thought of the boardroom James Whitfield once told him, "If you want to know who we are, look at the sink." He thought of the proud speeches he had given about fairness and opportunity. And he thought of Emma, standing in the steam of the dish station, her hands raw, her eyes dulled, her spirit still unbroken but dangerously close. By the time he lay down in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, he knew he was reaching his own breaking point. The CEO in him demanded patience, demanded strategy, demanded enough evidence to bring Dennis down without loopholes. But the man in him, the son of a woman who once scrubbed dishes in kitchens like these, the man who now saw Emma as more than just an employee, demanded action now. It was a war inside him, a battle between justice delayed and justice demanded, between playing the long game and protecting a single exhausted soul before she collapsed under the weight of it all. And as Ryan finally drifted into a restless sleep, one truth burned like fire in his chest. His time undercover was running out. The reveal. The sixth night began with a storm already hanging over the kitchen. The staff arrived weary, their faces set in grim masks, and the energy that usually carried them through the dinner rush was absent. Even the clatter of pots and the hiss of steam seemed duller, more forced, as if the kitchen itself knew what was coming. Ryan, wearing his crooked name tag that still read Kyle, felt the heaviness immediately when he stepped through the back door. He had learned to read the atmosphere of the room quickly, and tonight the air was tight, charged like static before lightning strikes. Emma stood at the dish station, already pale and trembling before the first table had even been seated. Her injured wrist was wrapped in a new bandage, but Ryan could see how stiffly she moved, how much pain it caused her simply to lift a pan. She was thinner than she had been a week ago, her cheeks hollow, her skin waxy with exhaustion. Yet still she worked because she had no choice. Ryan's chest tightened at the sight. He had promised himself he would not let her break. But tonight, as he picked up his brush and plunged his hands into the steaming sink, he wondered if he was already too late. The rush began slowly, then surged like a flood. Orders piled onto the counter, Dennis stormed back and forth like a tyrant, and the noise of clanging pans and shouted demands became deafening. Ryan scrubbed frantically, trying to keep up, but it was Emma who carried the brunt of it. Every time a server burst through the door, it was Emma's hands they dumped the trays on. Every time a cook tossed a scorched pan aside, it was Emma who bent over the sink to scrub it clean. Ryan kept glancing at her, worry gnawing at him. Her hands shook more than usual, her shoulders slumped, and her lips pressed together as though each breath was an effort. She was running on nothing but willpower. Then it happened. A cook shouted for clean plates, and Emma, rushing to grab a stack, stumbled. The plates slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor with a crash that silenced the kitchen. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Ryan saw Emma freeze, her face draining of color, her eyes wide with dread. And then Dennis was there. He stormed across the kitchen, his face twisted in rage, veins standing out in his neck. He jabbed a finger toward the shards of porcelain at Emma's feet. "That's it. I've had enough of your screw-ups, Hayes. Do you have any idea how much money you've cost this restaurant? First broken glasses, now plates. You're nothing but dead weight dragging us down." Emma's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands trembling as she bent to pick up the pieces. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so low Ryan barely heard it over the hum of the kitchen. "It won't happen again," Dennis sneered. "You're damn right it won't, because this is your last chance. One more mistake and you're out that door. You hear me? And don't think for a second anyone will care if you are. You're replaceable, Hayes. Worthless." The words sliced through Ryan like knives. He looked at Emma, at the way she bowed her head, silent, absorbing every cruelty without protest. And something inside him snapped. For nights he had held back, forced himself to be patient, to gather evidence, to think strategically. But as Dennis's voice thundered, tearing at Emma's dignity, Ryan felt the dam within him shatter. The CEO in him, the strategist, the planner, was gone. What remained was the man who had grown up watching his mother endure the same indignities, the man who had sworn he would never let history repeat itself under his watch. Ryan stepped forward, his gloves dripped with soapy water, his apron was stained like everyone else's, but his voice rang out with a force that silenced the kitchen. "Enough. The single word cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned. Emma froze, still crouched among the broken shards. Dennis spun toward Ryan, his mouth already twisting into another insult. "And who the hell do you think?" But Ryan didn't let him finish. He reached up, ripped the crooked name tag from his chest, and flung it onto the counter. His voice rose, steady and commanding, filling every corner of the kitchen. "My name isn't Kyle." He straightened his back, shoulders squared, eyes burning into Dennis. "It's Ryan Carter. I am the CEO of Western Dining Group, and I've spent the last 6 nights standing in this kitchen watching how you treat people, watching how you exploit them, watching how you break them down, and I'm done watching." The silence that followed was absolute. Cooks froze mid-motion. Servers stood gaping in the doorway. Even the hiss of the grill seemed to quiet as every eye turned to the man who, moments ago, had been just another dishwasher. Dennis blinked, his face a draining of color, then flushing crimson. He stammered, "You're lying. This is some kind of joke." Ryan's voice sharpened. "Does this look like a joke to you? I know everything. I've seen Emma work double shifts without pay. I've seen Maria forced to stay late. I've seen safety violations ignored, insults hurled, wages stolen. And I have it all documented, photos, notes, witnesses. Your days of hiding behind fear are over." Dennis's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked around the room for support, but no one met his eyes. The cook stared at the floor. The server stood frozen. Maria, the line cook, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Emma, still crouched on the floor, stared up at Ryan with wide, disbelieving eyes. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Ryan took a step closer to Dennis, his voice lowering but gaining in intensity. "You've built your authority on intimidation, but it ends tonight. You will step down as manager effective immediately. Corporate will be here tomorrow to take your statement and to investigate every single shift record you've falsified. And if you think this ends with a slap on the wrist, you're mistaken. I will personally make sure every illegal practice is brought to light." The room seemed to tremble under the weight of his words. Dennis sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead, his bluster unraveling. But Ryan didn't stop. He turned, sweeping his gaze across the entire staff. "And to the rest of you, hear me clearly. You are not invisible. You are not replaceable. You are the backbone of this company, and I will never again allow people like Dennis to treat you as anything less than human. Starting tonight, things change. Starting tonight, your dignity matters." For a moment, silence reigned, and then slowly, Maria stepped forward. Her voice shook as she said, "Thank you." Behind her, one of the cooks nodded, then another. The silence broke into murmurs, soft but so, welling, relief, disbelief, hope, flickering in voices that had long been silent. Emma still hadn't moved. She stared at Ryan as though seeing him for the first time, her eyes shimmering with tears that finally spilled down her cheeks. The notebook she had clutched so fiercely all week slipped from her fingers, falling open on the floor, pages of hours and notes fluttering like fragile wings. Ryan bent down, picked it up carefully, and placed it back into her hands. His voice softened. "You don't have to fight alone anymore." And for the first time in all the nights he had known her, Emma's lips curved into something faintly resembling a smile. Not of joy, not yet, but of something rarer, of relief. That night, as Dennis slunk away in silence, his authority shattered, Ryan knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Corporate investigations, structural changes, rebuilding trust. It would take months, maybe years. But for now, in this moment, one truth mattered most. Emma Hayes had been seen, and her silence had finally been broken. Transformation. The morning after the confrontation, the North Avenue Grill felt like a different place. The kitchen that had once pulsed with fear now thrummed with an uneasy but unmistakable sense of hope. The staff arrived quietly, still uncertain if last night's eruption had been real or some strange dream. But when they saw Dennis's office door locked and his nameplate gone, the truth settled over them like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Ryan had returned that morning, no longer in the faded uniform of Kyle the dishwasher, but in a crisp suit that seemed almost out of place in the greasy kitchen. Yet the staff who had scrubbed, chopped, and sweated beside him recognized him immediately. Not for the suit, not for the authority it represented, but for the voice they had heard rise against Dennis, for the fire in his eyes when he stood up for Emma. They no longer saw a stranger at the sink. They saw a man who had chosen to live their struggle to understand it. Corporate investigators arrived that afternoon, summoned by Ryan himself, carrying clipboards, cameras, and stern expressions. They interviewed the cooks, the servers, and Maria, who spoke trembling at first, then stronger as she realized she would not be punished for her honesty. They examined Emma's notebook, page after page of careful handwriting that chronicled hours worked, wages denied, promises broken. Ryan watched as the investigators nodded gravely, their pens scratching across paper, their expressions growing darker with each revelation. Dennis was called in for questioning. He blustered, he denied, he even shouted, but his voice no longer carried the power it once did. Without fear silencing them, the staff told the truth. Dennis's empire of intimidation crumbled in hours. By evening, his termination papers were signed, and he left the building not with the swagger of a ruler, but with the slouch of a man stripped bare. For once, it was Dennis who was silent. But the story did not end with his departure. Ryan knew that removing one cruel manager was not enough. The system itself needed to change. That night, he gathered the staff in the dining room, pushing tables together into a rough circle. The servers sat beside the cooks beside the dishwashers, their uniforms stained, their eyes wary but curious. At the head of the table stood Ryan, not as the distant CEO they had once only known by name, but as the man who had scrubbed dishes beside them. "I came here," Ryan began, his voice steady, carrying to every corner of the room, "because I heard whispers that something was wrong. I thought I might find small mistakes, maybe a few bad habits, but what I found was far worse. I found people working until their bodies broke, without pay, without respect, without dignity. I found silence born from fear, and I found one woman who, despite everything, ever stopped fighting in the only way she could, by recording the truth line by line, shift by shift." His eyes moved to Emma, who sat at the far end of the table, her notebook clutched to her chest. She looked down quickly, but not before Ryan caught the flicker of pride in her eyes. He continued, "This stops now. Not just here, but across every restaurant we own. No more unpaid shifts. No more intimidation. No more managers who believe people are disposable. Starting today, we are rebuilding this company from the inside out. And it begins with you. Each of you deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. And I promise you, this will not be empty words. You will see it in your paychecks, in your hours, and in the way you are treated." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling in. Then Maria whispered, almost to herself, "I never thought anyone would care." Others nodded, eyes glistening with tears they had long hidden. Ryan's gaze softened. "I care. And I'm not the only one. Because you are not invisible. You never were. But sometimes leaders forget that the numbers on their spreadsheets are human lives. And sometimes it takes going back to the sink, back to the heart of the kitchen, to remember." Over the next weeks, changes rippled outward. Paychecks were corrected, overtime was honored. New policies were put in place, and a hotline was established so no employee would ever fear retaliation for speaking out again. Managers across the company were retrained, some replaced, and standards were rewritten with dignity at their core. And through it all, Emma's life began to shift. No longer crushed beneath double shifts without pay, she was able to breathe. She still worked hard, her character would never allow otherwise, but now her effort was recognized, her hours respected. One morning, Ryan visited her apartment, bringing with him, not corporate documents, but a bag of groceries and a small gift for Lily and Matt.